spend the hour pretty much talking. The title that was given, what I'd like to say was psychopharmacology, which is fine. I love pharmacology. Drugs are a favorite pastime of mine, both in research and in inquiry. And if they do something with the psycho half of the body, I'm even more fond of it because it's an area in which I am most curious and I would like to learn. So I would like to speak initially about where we are now in the area of psychopharmacology and specifically in the area of psychedelic drugs, and where we are going, which is a little bit of a grim picture in many ways, and kind of try to see what's up ahead. But let me start with where we are. I got a phone call maybe 6 months ago from a person I had never met, didn't know the name, a Dr. Lynn at NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse. And she said, Dr. Shulgin said, we are putting together a NIDA conference that will lead to a NIDA symposium, and it's going to be entitled The Classic Hallucinogens. And I said, fine, good. Said, we'd like to have you participate and give us a rundown on the analogs and what's known about the classic hallucinogens. Fine. I asked her, I'm not quite sure what you mean by hallucinogens, and I'm certainly not sure what you mean by classical. So she said, well, you know what I mean. Classical, we don't want to get into PCP, and we've already done a monograph, 2-3 monographs on marijuana, and the kappa receptors and the sigma receptors of opioids, that's not really it. You know, the classic ones. Okay, fine. I love giving seminars at NIDA because they always end up coming in neat little monographs, usually 1.5 inches thick. They distribute to the people who work in the area of public health. And it's a doubly great treasure because what you talk about, they put in the monograph. And you can say about anything you want, and they are not very comfortable about censoring it out, and they don't send it out to referees or reviewers, and it's a neat way of getting stuff in the literature that sometimes is a little hard to get in. The whole area of publishing, I presume by hallucinogens she meant psychedelics, was it's taken about 20 years to get to the term hallucinogens away from psychotomimetics, which was in vogue back in the 50s, things that caused psychosis, imitated psychosis, and they tried then to get into hallucinogens. It took a generation, and I would say probably if things progress in the same snail's pace they've been going, in another generation you'll actually hear people in government positions using the word psychedelic. Not in my lifetime, I'm certain, but it might well occur. And the last time they had one of these marvelous things, about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, and I was at it, and I had a lot of fun. I actually wrote 3 papers for it, presented 3 different things, and amongst that was what turned out to be quite an interesting coincidence. I wrote about a material that I thought was kind of an interesting material. It's called methoxymethylene dioxyamphetamine, or MDMA, and I mentioned that it had some interesting properties, and they went ahead and published it in a government GPO published publication known as the NIDA monograph. So in a sense, the first human publication on MDMA, which became later known as ecstasy and Adam and other names, actually occurred in the government monograph, along with the first mention of the human level of 5-methoxy-DMT. A lot of little things got tucked in, so I said, good, let's have another symposium, and I've got a whole bunch of things which I've never published, and I'm just going to work them in there, which I did. And it worked out quite nicely. I sent the paper in. I presented 9 slides. I decided to call what I chose to call the classic hallucinogens, and so I took those things from which there had been maybe 10 or 20 analogs made, things that I could construe in some way as being prototypes of families of psychedelics. And the 9 slides will be the 9 tables in the book, and it should be appeared from NIDA probably by the end of the year. So I'd like to kind of go over in a very loose way the families, but not specifically all the families, because I did a little bit of machinery work in there. I tucked things in for reasons that will become apparent, I trust, in the next 10 years, just to get them in and get them documented, get them published by the government, and get them into the hands of people who can use the information. Basically, of course, one of the principal, earliest, best studied, and probably a master archetype of psychedelics is mescaline. As I mentioned in a talk earlier this week, it was my introduction to the area some 40 years ago, and it has always had a very, very soft spot in my heart. It comes from peyote. This is a territory that I know you're familiar with, and I'm not going to elaborate too much on it. Peyote, Anahalonium levinii, Lophophora williamsi, whatever genus species. The mushroom world is not alone in having multiple binomial names for plants. I don't think there's an area of botany that has not fought tooth and nail, shedding blood on how to reorganize genera and how to undercut your competitor by using another name for a species. In fact, the beautiful thing on the march today was the splitters and the lumpers. I thought that was well presented in the placards that were used. Peyote, Trichoceros pachinoi, the San Pedro cactus is a superb source of mescaline. There are other alkaloids in the peyote. They might contribute to the overall activity, but that's not known, and it's a question that's never been resolved. From that has grown a large family of chemical derivatives. I absolutely refuse to go to Blackboard and do my dirty picture job, where you draw benzene rings and long chains and amino groups and methoxy groups. It's neat when you're giving a seminar at a graduate school and can have chemists there who kind of groove on SN2 displacements and Friedel-Crafts reactions. But it's not appropriate, and it's a marvelous way of putting credibility into what you're saying, especially if you're working in an academic environment, but it's not appropriate there. Anyway, the methoxy groups, ethoxys, larger groups, again, as you got onto larger groups, the activity dropped off. There was nothing of great interest. Somewhere along the line, talking with my buddy Peyton, we said, you know, oxygen's a neat little compound. Let's put a sulfur into mescaline. No one's ever put a sulfur in there. And so we put a sulfur in, we developed a material, thiomescaline, that was about 20 times more potent, and really not at all the friendly, benign earth softness of mescaline. It was a rather an aggressive thing. Smelled of LSD. It had that little pushiness to it. So it didn't need and you've got to learn to kind of meet like polar bears. You've got to meet these compounds at a modest distance and establish a rapport early in the interactions. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself walking backwards. Anyway, we got sulfur in the molecule. And that was a marvelous thing. We put sulfur in a number of places. There's only one place that did any good. Built out groups, did all kinds of marvelous manipulations, and managed to add about 10 or 12 neat little psychedelics to the published literature. So this was still back in the marvelous days in the 70s, where you could publish easily in the scientific literature. There is an element of conservatism that has crept into the scientific world as well, that says, oh, this is work that has been done in humans. Well, of course, I've done it for 30 years in humans. Fine, well, that's all right. You're part of the old buddy collection. You go ahead and we'll publish your work. Then the lawyers get into it. They say, are you sure that you should allow this work to be published? After all, it might be construed as being improper. And so I get a letter from the editor saying, we'd like to publish this, but we would like to have evidence of its having been approved by your Human Health Commission, your Human Health Board. So no problem. So I got someone to be my Human Health Board and we get permission, and that would appear. It's now gotten to the point where it is not even with that is it very easy to put new human data on psychedelic drugs in the literature. The argument is, well, you should really get an IND through the FDA with an NDA and an approval and all these little lettered jobs, which is a great deal of work, and usually in the academic world, it can be done relatively simply. In the industrial world, it is a $10 million investment. And I'm frankly not that interested in investing to ask someone else permission to do this, so I just quietly publish in NIDA research monographs. Much a simpler way. Anyway, abandoning mescaline, we found another whole family that I've called the 2C family. A marvelous little group of phenethylamines, that's the last of the technical word, a group of compounds in which there is an orientation on the ring with a little spot at one place in which you can tack on all kinds of goodies. And every time you put another goodie on there, you get a different compound. They're active, they're individual, they're unique, and sometimes they're very potent, sometimes they're not so pleasant. But the 2C family turned out to be a monster family of compounds. The very first of them, the one with a simple methyl group there, has actually in clinical study today in Germany, where there's quite a bit of research going on not in noisy public and not totally in private. It's done with the benign turning of the eyes in the other direction of the German government. It's a very nice way in which there is some clinical studies with MDMA, some clinical studies with 2,4-D. This is the 2C compound with the methyl group. It's very close to DOM or STP. And it's also called LE25 there, LE for Leuna, and 25, I think, possibly to imitate the fact that LSD was known as 25, and the number has some image that it carries along with it. 2CB, a bromo compound, was a neat contribution, because bromine is a material that's very nice for making materials labeled with radioactive bromine, but usually bromine is not part and parcel of a centrally active compound. There are some, but not many. We had an interesting thing, an outgrowth of that was a material DOB. This is a bromine amphetamine compound, 2,5-dimethoxy-4-bromoamphetamine. I'm sorry about that, but that's what it is. In which we did some neat work with bromine 77 and bromine 82, two nice little radioactive bromines. We did bootleg this at the Lawrence Radiation Lab, where they don't really want people injecting each other with radioactive psychedelics. we did have a key to the place and knew how to run the positron camera, and we did it after hours and found some very interesting results. If you put the bromine in the molecule, and you have to hustle a little bit, it has about a 30-hour half-life. You put the bromine in the molecule into one of us, and you lie out on a scanning bed gamma emission camera and scan us over the camera, you develop on the oscilloscope a very nice picture from the top of the head, down through the body to the toes of where you are. And you see the outline of the person. You inject the radioactive bromine, and of course, then you run the picture again, and you see a little radioactivity sort of bleed. No injections are as good as they say in the trade. A little bit of bleeding around, bromine around the area of injection. And then pretty soon the liver begins getting glowing a little bit. You run another scan, and the liver's still pretty bright. The next thing is, of course, the little tennis ball-shaped bladders getting a little bit of radioactivity, but you're seeing where the radioactivity goes in the body. And by golly, the radioactivity went to the lung. You know, this is a psychedelic that's supposed to be going up here. It goes to the lung. And third hour, fourth hour, the lung went to a pretty high level and then began dropping off, and stuff began going into the brain. As if it were going in the lung, and something was happening in the lung that maybe metabolized it to something neat with active. And the material takes about 4 hours to get into full activity. It's really a long-lived psychedelic, DOB, and it can last 36, 48 hours. And you don't really get into rolling with it until about the third or fourth hour, and you're up at a pretty hot place for about 6 or 8 hours after that. So suddenly, hey, this is neat. I bet maybe the lung is the center of the mind. How about that? Maybe. I mean, after all, what gives you the idea that the brain? You take the brain out, the person's not functioning. Take your lung out, the person's not functioning. And there's a lot of nice metabolic stuff that goes in life. The liver, you know, does all chewing up marvelous things, does metabolism, changes things. But so does the lung. It's really a rich place for potential metabolism. They said, no, I bet we goofed. I bet we injected some particulate stuff in there, and it got hung up in the capillary beds. So then we made it orally, made the same material again, and 3 days later, I think another person decided to lie in the camera this time, and gave it to the person orally. We knew it hit the liver, but would it also then go to the lung before it went to the head? And it did. So here we have a neat little insight, which we published very nicely, avoided a little bit of legal complications. In fact, they didn't want to publish it because it was human data, and fortunately we knew the lawyer at Lawrence Lab quite well, who wrote a rather sharp letter to the editor, and it did appear. But it's been totally ignored. I think it's an absolutely delightful concept in a psychedelic. Go and you say, okay, you're looking at the radioactivity, the bromine comes off, and that's what you're seeing in the bladder, but you look at it and there's no radioactive bromide ion. So you're seeing something that is associated very tightly with a psychedelic, and it goes into the lung. Isn't it? Nice little throwaway. Anyway, back to 2CB, 2CI, the iodine counterpart, a material even more potent and relatively easy to make. The bromine is by far the easiest to make, but the 2CI is quite easy. And this leads into its 3-carbon counterpart, the amphetamine counterpart, DOI, which turned out to be quite an interesting compound for yet another reason. DOB appeared about I think it published first something like early 1970s. And within a 6-month period, two other groups, myself and 2 other groups independently published DOB and its activities. The other groups in animal, I did it in man. But 3 separate groups came up with that within a few months of one another. I was one and 2 others. I happened to be publishing first. but it was a coincidence. Actually, it was independently discovered by three research groups. The DOI was the obvious outgrowth. I made it immediately to see what it would do. Again, a very potent rascal, 2 milligrams, 1.5 milligrams, total oral dose. And you're out of it for 36 hours. It's kind of a lot of bang for the buck, as they say. All of a sudden, Haight-Ashbury, the summer of love, up comes LSD, up comes DOB, up comes DOI, not DOI, DOB, STP, all these things suddenly came on the street. And the Bureau of Narcotics says, you know, they're not narcotics, they're hippie drugs. And so the government made the FDA into a law enforcement group, and they passed a thing called it's called BDAC, Bureau of Drug Abuse Control Amendments or something. And suddenly the FDA became policemen, and all the psychedelics were put under the hands of the FDA. And so suddenly they had badges and scarves and guns and practice and Rudy Toot and went out raiding laboratories. So you had the FBI, which had a little bit going on. You had the local police, you had the Bureau of Narcotics, you had the FDA, all trying to play their game against the laboratory where they figured something naughty is going on. But they didn't have the authority until they found out what was going on. And so they all kind of came in and got each other's way. It was a real mess. And so they finally dissolved, and they made what they called the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, BNDD, and that finally got resolved into becoming the DEA, and that's where things are today. But at that time, just at the time of the Haight-Ashbury, these materials were suddenly very, very much prominent, very much talked about, and became very, very illegal. And they were plopped into a category that eventually became the Schedule I category of the Controlled Substance Act in 1970. Well, fortunately, a lot of things I was working with, exploring around, playing with at the time, had sneaked their way into the Haight-Ashbury because I gave seminars, I taught how to make things, I how to put them, how to get the molecules together, what their activity was. But fortunately, I had the other side of the closet that was completely unpublished, in which are things I hadn't talked about. And of course, they did not become illegal. And so one study got a very interesting touch of discretion. DOM, which was one of the early, very, very potent compounds. I sent a sample off to Saul Snyder, who was at Johns Hopkins, still is there in the neurology. And he found a very interesting thing, and then it hit the streets of San Francisco, and he published with a person in the West Coast human studies of it and what it did at higher levels. And it became quite notorious, became quite illegal, became a lot of papers about how awful it was. And then he got back to me and said, hey, that was kind of a neat compound. You got anything more like that? And I said, Saul, you know, it's neat, but, you know, you just made that Schedule I, and you just put the kiss of death on any research. Oh, I never thought of it. He said, you're right. You know, that was probably a little bit hasty. I said, I have another immediate homologue of it. It's called DOET. Originally I called it DOE, M, methyl, DOM, ethyl, DOE. Then someone says, well, DOE actually is desoxyephedrine, which is methamphetamine. So he put the T on there, called DOET. And I said, I'll give it to you, but you got to promise. You don't put it into people at levels that makes them all go flaky and publish and get it illegal. I said, promise, won't. And so you got it, you put it in the clinical studies, but you kept the dosage low. And of course, at low dosages, psychedelics are not the same as psychedelics at large. In fact, we had a whole seminar this morning on low doses, high doses, if I recall. Went very smoothly. So he got it was more or less of a seminar this morning. He got the dosages small, and he said, by golly, you know what we can do? We'll call this a cognitive enhancer, which is a neat term that had never been used before. Obviously something that makes you a little smarter or write things a little more quickly or a little bit better or something. And they published a nice clinical study on a DOAT, a potential cognitive enhancer, but they kept the dosage down around 3 and 4 milligrams, which is neat. Of course, you go up to 6 or 8 milligrams, it's just like DOM, it's a wild psychedelic. But that's never been published, and it never has become illegal. And so I learned a lesson from that. You know, it's how you present something. It's not what you present, it's how you present it that sometimes dictates the way things will flow in the future. So we had DOET, and then again, that old sulfur idea, let's put a sulfur in there. We got what we call the Aleph series, Aleph 1, Aleph 2. Turned out to be fascinating compounds, very potent, but totally unpredictable as to dose response. Some people would be very, very sensitive to them. Same dosage to other people would give absolutely no response at all. And we more or less abandoned that direction. Anyway, the DOI was particularly interesting because A, it was presented in a way that never became illegal. We just didn't talk about any psychedelic action. It just, here was the compounds like DOB, had the same action as DOB, had the same duration, same potency as DOB, but you had to go back to the original paper to see what DOB did, and no one bothers reading in the literature. So all you know, here's an active compound, it's like another. And it turned out quite neatly, this is, I guess, is fine as public information, sure. DOI turns out to be probably one of the, if not the most potent agonists and ligands for the so-called 5-HT2, I forget the talk about lumpers and splitters. You used to see what they're doing to the serotonin receptor sites. It used to be serotonin receptor site, then serotonin 5-HT1, 5-HT2, 2A, 2B, 2C, 3, 3A, and they must have about a dozen of them out there now. Someday they'll discover there's only one serotonin and sort of clean them up a little bit. But that's, again, another little touch that the mushroom people have led the way on splitting. Turns out the DOI is one of the most potent of the agonists in that receptor site. And so this company back east in Boston that makes neurotransmitter ligands makes it commercially available, DOI. And it is commercially available. Then they discovered somewhere through probably a seminar I'd given somewhere that it was psychedelic, so the price went up about tenfold. But it's still available as a receptor site agonist. It is not illegal. And so anyone really wants to explore the idea of commercial availability of centrally active psychedelics, explore the chemical catalogs, especially in the area of neurotransmitter studies. Anyway, another big family is one that DMT, dimethyltryptamine, very, very well studied compound. I think you had Terence McKenna here last year, or year before, and I'm sure he talked at some length about DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a component of a number of plants, a component of snuffs from South America, a component in the ayahuasca, which is a mixture of plants from South America. And it is an area that is my current present love. I'm now getting into the not pharmacologically, of course. I don't use drugs. I mean the idea of chemistry. It's a fascinating area of chemistry, and I found that I make the T-butyl, the N-methyl, N-T-butyl. These materials are active compounds. They've never been published. They're not even known. The area of the tryptamines is just the same virgin field the area of phenethylamines was 30 years ago. And so I'm really going into this area with a great deal of interest, and it's going to be a treasure house of activities, types of activities, and new compounds. The dimethyltryptamine, diethyltryptamine, they both happen to be Schedule 1s because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dipropyltryptamine is an interesting twilight. It's getting up to the area where activity suddenly becomes oral. You don't have to go totally injection or smoking or parenteral route. You get some activity orally. I got a phone call. I was going to get into where we're going. Okay, I'm going to continue. If it's still raining outside, you're stuck. Okay. I got a phone call from a reporter in New York, and he said, I'm writing a paper on dipropyltryptamine. Good. He said, I got your name, and I'd like to have some information if I can. I said, well, I'll talk to you if it's not for attribution, my usual phrase. I'll give you all the information I have. And said, fine, that's okay by me. It's being used by a church called the Temple of the True Awakening, or something like this, down toward the Battery in New York. I said, that's interesting. Yeah, it's a sacrament. I subsequently have contacted the church, and I have a correspondence going. They are sincere. I mean, they are really the Church of the True Awakening, and the DPT, dipropyltryptamine, is truly their sacrament. And if they both smoke it, and they only smoking orally. And I told him this is the activity. It's active 100 and 120 milligrams. It has some activity orally. You have to go a little bit higher. It's metabolized by deamination, this, that, and the other, a little bit of information. And he said, thank you very much. He's writing down vigorously. And I said, by the way, he said, how did you have to get my name? Why'd you ask me? Oh, I was given your name. Okay, by whom? Oh, yes, it was by Zapienza of the DEA. Oh, so it suddenly occurred to me, here is the material. The DEA is fully aware of what's going on. Otherwise, they wouldn't know about it. But they don't want to get involved because, obviously, they're not scaring the horses. They're staying inside the temple. They're doing their little thing. They're not selling. They're not buying. There's no money transaction. It smells of religion. Leave it alone. So they didn't want to be associated with knowing about it, but they wanted to accommodate getting information, so the DEA gave my name, and I talked to the person and provided a little insight into the idea of what can or cannot be done depending on how loudly you wear it on your sleeve, and how much noise you want to make about it, or if you want to frighten the horses. Be cautious. And there is a certain amount of laissez-faire. The diisopropyl tryptamine was a fascinating compound. I was caught quite unexpected by it. It's orally active. A relatively low dosage, I think 20, 25 milligrams. And it had no effect. I was looking for visuals, no visuals. I was looking for any heart effects, nothing, no respiratory problems, no cardiovascular problems, except the stupid radio went wrong. I listened to the radio, and they were playing, I forget the name of the composer. It was a young person's guide to the symphony. And it was terrible, just absolutely terrible. The bassoon was flat. The percussion clearly was done by an amateur. I figured the San Jose Youth Orchestra or something was putting on the thing. Turned out to be some big name and some big operation. And it was me, not the radio, not the symphony. And so I went in and started pounding on the piano, and I found, most amazingly, you could hit a note, and the note was flat. But it was not flat scrunched down like a record. You get a record going, you put your thumb on the edge of the record, and you're all the things are in proportion, but they're all flat. This was not. It's as if everything had dropped 100 cycles. And so high notes were not just a little bit flatter, low notes were way flatter, and all harmonic thing was garbage. And I listened with total fascination. And I looked for visuals, I looked for one thing or another, nothing else. It was just strictly an auditory screw-up. And I subsequently had an ally in England try the compound, same auditory screw-up. He put it through his group, I put it through my group. Basically the same response there. What are you going to do for it? It'd be a fascinating compound to study the auditory integrity of the brain, perhaps. I'd be fantastic if you want to go into an audition to join the symphony and you put it in the coffee of your competitor. I published it, stuck in one of these little journals that comes out for 2 years, and it reverses its name and comes out. I think it was Communications in Psychopharmacology. It was good for 2 years, and they had some editing problems. They became Psychopharmacology Communications. That lasted for 2 years, and then it disappeared. So these is another way of marvelous tucking stuff away in the literature. You put it in these little, very, very hungry scientific journals. You have no idea the hunger of some of these journals. Every time you turn around, there are 4 more journals in your area that's suddenly coming out. Some professor at the University of something or other who wants to really leave his mark on the world, so he's going to be the prime editor of a new journal. And these things are starved for publication because there's, even though people are publishing as rapidly as they can, there just is not that much trivial work that can be done that can be published on. And so there is a certain hunger. So the new journals automatically get a list of advisory editors. I don't know how many journals I'm an advisory editor of. And you may have an advisory editorial staff of 40 people. And the letters go out, you are now an advisory editor on this. Desperately, we need papers. What are you publishing? Get something in here. Get all your friends to get something in there. And you know the journal may have a half-life of 1.5 years or 2 years. And so you can tuck stuff in there, and it gets published with a little bit of desperation, and the journal disappears. Then you get these letters 10 years later. I'm trying to run a bibliographic search on stuff you've published. I can't find the journals. Well, sure you can't find it. There are $400 or $500 a year subscriptions to the medical centers who stopped subscribing, and the journals went under. It's amazing to see the volume of medical, scientific, technical literature that is totally inaccessible because the journals were so expensive they couldn't be subscribed to by the libraries, and then they went out of business. And where do you find it? Well, maybe you know who the editor was, and he'll have it on his shelf in his office, and you say, hey, Joe, can I get a copy of an article that appeared in your paper some time ago? Anyway, I'm off on a tangent. So anyway, the isopropyl tryptamine was fascinating. I went into the 5-methoxys of these. The 5-methoxy DMT is certainly now becoming very rapidly established as a well-known, well-studied psychedelic. It has been documented as being a component in the venom of the Colorado frog, the Sonora frog. In this toad smoking, I had saw an interesting documentary on frog licking and frog smoking that came out of Australia. Apparently, the toad that is in the Sonora toad is a desert toad. The toad they moved into Australia to take care of the cane, whatever the beetle I guess it was, turned out to be the Murinus, the wet toad. And they moved it into Australia to get the beetles. Of course, the toads didn't get the beetles because the beetles ate at night and the toads didn't, or the beetles that ate at the top of the stalk and the toads didn't. Anyway, all Australia got was another problem. They seem every 15 years to move in a new animal to control an old problem, or have a new animal become a new problem to which they've got to bring in something as a vector to control that. Anyway, the most recent one is the cane toad, and this marvelous a film documentary on it, showed the toad reproducing and hopping around the eastern northern part of Australia, and dogs dying and kids having marvelous times, and people trying to hit them on the in copulo, if that's the right term, on the highways at night with their cars. It became quite a going sport. And then they had this one brief segment of a obviously long-bearded hippie hair down to here, eyes all wiggled out, with some sort of a television trick so you couldn't identify who it was. And he was commenting on how good the toad venom was. And it came out something like, hey man, it's really good. And that was it for the human documentation of the venom. And so I was not particularly impressed. I wish I had kept the documentary. It was 59 minutes of cars and toads on highways, and 1 minute of a hippie saying, man, that was good. I have every reason to believe, Andy just put out a paper, I saw it just recently and read it, on how perhaps this is an error that has sneaked into the anthropological literature as identification of which bufo does what job. Anyway, the area, of course, of dearest interest to you is the area of the psilocybin, the psilocybe mushrooms, and the other species, other genera that carry the active alkaloids. Again, orally active, present in the molecule as a phosphate ester psilocybin, as the free phenolic, very unstable compound psilocin. The compounds with N-diethyls have been made by Sandoz. They have been given code names. They have been studied in conjunction with psychotherapy, and they have been actively studied in Germany. This is about it for the human studies of psilocybin analogs. It is a wide open field. You have a complete variation possible on the oxygen of the phenol, on the nitrogen of the tryptamine, on the indole ring itself. One could sit down in 10 minutes on a blackboard, write 100 structures, all of which would be potentially active psychedelics, and not one of them has been made or tested in man. If they've been made by Sandoz, they have certainly not published any human data on it. A treasure of an area. I hope to get into it once I get through some of the DMT magic that is yet to be unraveled, but it's an area which could be extraordinarily productive for research. The last of the areas that I mentioned in the NIDA presentation was the area of LSD. LSD has always been held up as being sort of the ultimate, the most potent, the most dramatic of all the materials. I periodically get into discussions with people who say, well, what is the plant it comes in? LSD is not a natural material. It is synthetic. It has to be made from naturally obtained stock, namely the surgic acid stock must come from an ergot or from a morning glory or from some plant source. It can be synthesized, but it's 28 steps with a 0.2% yield, so you don't do it that way. But you can get it quite easily. People say, well, gee, if we could only control, I hear the authorities, if you only control the source of the ergot or ergonovine or ergometrine or whatever it is, we could control LSD. And I remember last time I was at a little meeting, in fact, I'll get a little later into where we're going, which I'll talk about LSD, DEA in San Francisco. But at one outgrowth of that meeting, this is the right time to say it, is the person said, well, if you can control the surgic acid, I said, have you ever heard of Claviceps paspali? And he said, oh, you mean purpuri? I said, no, paspali. No. It's a neat little variant of Claviceps. In fact, I was talking the other day about a fungi. I don't think I ever got into the marvelous fact that these Claviceps things are fantastically easily available. You can go right off to the group in, I think it's in Alabama somewhere, that's a government source of inoculums of various fungi, various bacteria, and you write back them and send them $3 or something for bothering to do it, and they'll send you a slant that will have whatever you want on it, and you get from them the paspali, and you can inoculate a normal broth and get approximately 3 grams per 100 ml of ergot material in about 48 hours of incubation. So there's no question about getting kilogram amounts very willing to take a little time, so you don't really have to bother finding out how it's imported from Czechoslovakia to Italy and smuggled in from Italy to this country. You can do it in your attic, and there is no limitation whatsoever in the quantity of the surgic acid. Actually, you don't get the surgic acid out of the inoculum, you get a propanolamide. But you boil it up in benzene, and that amide comes off, and you end up with surgic acid. So anyway, this gets up more or less. Oh yeah, one thing I was going to say on this that I presented in the NIDA thing, because the human data had never been published. I had developed a number of ways of getting at different places in the molecule, and working with another person who was there but did not choose to talk about some of the activity. Got into the D ring, the big ring up at the top of LSD, and got the methyl group off. which is called now nor-LSD, and began putting on other goodies up there, ethyl, allyl, propyl, phenethyl, benzyl, different marvelous things off the shelf. And it turns out that both the ethyl and the allyl compounds, to be technically called ethyl nor-LSD and allyl nor-LSD, are approximately twice as potent as LSD and quite more shortly lived. The whole duration is perhaps 5-6 hours instead of the 8 or 10 from LSD. And the typical dosage, instead of the 80 or 120 of LSD, is around 40 or 50 micrograms. So here is a nice little bit of things to tuck into the NIDA bulletin. This will appear as human data in the next NIDA bulletin on the structure activity studies of the classic hallucinogens. Thank you, Government Printing Office. Where are we going? I mentioned LSD in San Francisco. This is a fascinating meeting. This is now more or less not into review of the psychedelics, but kind of a review of some of the little anecdotes of what's going on now to give a flavor of the kind of direction that things might go. I've learned not to try to predict the future, because partly if you, A, predict the future, and it turns out to be along the lines you're thinking about doing things in the future anyway, you come out to be a person sort of self-fulfilling the prophecy, and you become the messenger and you're shot at. So it's easier not to bring the message and let the message evolve and just say what might occur. And I would like to talk about what might occur, but I want to talk about that in the guise of some anecdotes of things I've just recently encountered in what is at present reality. LSD in San Francisco, there was a meeting either December 12th, 13th or December 13th, 14 in San Francisco, hosted by the DEA, law enforcement invited from around the world, and it must have been 125, 150 people there. So I know it must have been around the world, because of the names and people there. I recognize one from Holland, one from Australia, and one from England. And the DEA itself was the host. And I was told I was going to be invited to be present and give a review of the history, the psychiatric use of LSD. And I told my potential informant advisor, who happened to be an intelligence in the DEA, said, have you read my book, Picao, which might turn out to be a little bit of egg on your face if they suddenly discover that I'm also the author of that book, and they say, who invited him here? And you're the one who have to say, I did, and why don't you look at the book first and make sure you still want to invite me or have me invited. He looked at the book, he phoned me about 2 weeks later and said, let's pretend you were never invited, which is a very nice way out of it. I said, the book was offensive then. Oh, the book is fine, that's not it at all. So well, why not invited? Well, it turned out, he said, that intelligence was all for it, but it's compliance. They said, what I might do is be there and engage Bonner, who's the head of the DEA, engage Bonner in a public debate that would be embarrassing. Oh, so I began thinking, embarrassing to who? I mean, I'm not going to get embarrassed. I'm going to engage number 3 law enforcement man in the country in a public thing in an embarrassing debate. Okay, idiot, I'm not going to do that. No. Embarrassing to him? What kind of opinion does the DEA have of their head man? If I, little gray-haired fart, gets in there and says something all of a sudden makes him embarrassed? Not like it. Anyway, so thank you. I'm glad I just do not go. We're happy. And I got a rundown of what went on in that meeting from a couple of people who served as effective moles and told me what really occurred. And it was really a frightening thing. It was there's a term you're now getting more and more familiar with. Wait, in 10 years you'll be very familiar with it, known as jihad, the holy war. The DEA is declaring a holy war against LSD. This is the evil drug. This is evil incarnate. This is the thing that will destroy our youth if it continues into the schools as it has gone. This is a monster. That was not their word. It was like monster. With many tendrils around the world, the head of which is in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is a material that I kid you not, I paraphrased, because I don't have the exact words. This is a material that once you have taken LSD, the residual molecules linger in the body, and they are stored, not somewhere, specifically right there in the frontal lobes of the brain, and they're stored there indefinitely, and it may be 20 years before they pop out, causing a flashback and psychosis. Actually, if you start figuring out, if you have a normal half-life of a few hours, you figure out how many molecules of LSD linger after a 50 microgram exposure, you don't get 20 years, you don't get 20 days. I mean, the compound is gone. There's no lingering molecule. But this psychiatrist, I can't get the exact pejorative word as an adjective in front of each of the nouns, but let me sort of make up as we go. deluded psychiatrists who are misinformed as to the so-called use of LSD in the conducting of not improper therapy, but something negative. They are actually doing this LSD with their patients as a means of justifying their own addiction. What else came out in there? It came on one thing after another. Oh, San Francisco has one of the greatest homeless problems in the world. And 20 years ago, we had in San Francisco the Summer of Love. These children, LSD everywhere, 20 years. What you have now is the residue. You have reaped the harvest of LSD usage, and these homeless, these mentally unstable people are a consequence of LSD use. And on and on. Oh, the underground chemists go out every week into the forests around the Bay Area where they have hidden their stash of their glutamine tartrate. And they bring it back to the laboratory and synthesize just enough LSD to take into the junior high schools and high schools that following week, without burying their stash again until the following week when they repeat this cycle. Here you have academic heavyweights. UCLA, I won't name, it's improper. Academic heavyweights sitting down there petrified. They were absolutely unable, or they chose not, to raise a voice of protest to this absolute unmitigated horseshit. And it's being bought. And the arguments go such as, we've got the cocaine problem under pretty much of a stable situation now. We know where it comes from, we know how it gets in, and we've got it pretty well stable. So the increase of funds that would be coming from the point of view of pursuing a cocaine importation can be diverted into LSD. So actually, it's a direction that is a true holy war that is developing. Other things in the legal area. I was in a preliminary hearing about one of your favorite little areas, psilocybin. This person was accused of raising psilocybin mushrooms. They call them magic mushrooms for commercial purposes. I mean, if you have mushrooms, obviously you possess them for commercial purposes with intent to sell, intent to distribute, intent to whatever else the charges might be. And I was talking to the lawyer for the defense, the prosecutor there, and the chemist from the prosecutor's side. I was asked, do you know how to tell whether a mushroom is a magic mushroom? Well, you have the disadvantage of sometimes being a little bit honest, and you have to say, well, there are a lot of things that might be misleading. You really have to determine that if there is indeed psilocybin or psilocin inside the mushroom, and at least then you know it would have the property that would fit the requirement you're looking for. The chemist for the prosecution said, that's not at all necessary. I can look through a window from 20 feet and identify them without any error.
Not across the I can read it.
Oh no, it's magic mushrooms. I don't care what genus it is. Those are magic mushrooms. And how, asked the attorney who I was there at the invitation of, can you do that with such accuracy? He said, it's very simple. I went to a 3-hour course that was being given by the law enforcement group on how to identify magic mushrooms, and I studied, I took notes, and I've learned I can do it flawlessly. And can you do that, I was asked? I said, no. So I was thrown out, I have no value. He is in there as a witness, and the people were prosecuted for raising magic mushrooms, because they were identified through a window across 20 feet of a room, growing over there on the far side of the room. That is the kind of stretching of evidence that's a little bit awkward. When I talked to you about 4 years ago, I gave a kind of a heavy-duty feeling of where things are going in the law enforcement direction. And I'm uncomfortable that some of these things have come to be. The analog drug bill is now in force. There is an analog drug bill that makes it no longer necessary to actually identify by name, submit to the public for consideration, and then get permission to put a material into Schedule 1. Remember, the things that are of no medical utility are by definition of high abuse potential. There is no such thing that is medically unrecognized that is of low abuse potential. It just does not exist in the pharmacopoeia. So now materials will be considered analogs of Schedule 1 or 2 materials if they meet one of 3 criteria. One is if they have a structure that is substantially similar to a Schedule 1 or 2 drug. Nowhere does the law define what's substantially similar. And I'm an old student of rhetoric, and you have terms that are marvelous in rhetoric. You have what are called disclaimers, and substantially identical. What is that? You have substantially identical, which means about the same. Or you have similar, which means about the same. But what substantially similar means is totally meaningless. But the law uses it, and the law does not define it. If a material has a activity that is substantially similar to a Schedule 1 drug, a 1 or 2 drug, it is an analog. Or if a material is promoted as having an activity equal to or greater than a Schedule 1 or 2 drug, it becomes an analog. And of course, if it is an analog, then any intent to use it in man allows the act to be prosecuted as if the material were a Schedule 1 drug. This means that anything that in any court could be said to be substantially similar can, if it's given to man or intended to be given to man, be prosecuted as a Schedule 1 felony, which substantially makes the development, the possession, or the use of anything that changes the state of consciousness a felony, in a blanket sense. The law has been brought to court, it's been challenged, and it has succeeded, has weathered the challenge. So the concept of analog is now defined by the authorities. This is an analog of that because it is substantially similar. Down in a Los Angeles Ventura trial, I heard the person who came in for the prosecution, the chemist, a young lady, said two things were substantially similar if they're over 50% identical. And I'd love to have taken that apart on philosophic grounds, but I was not free to do so. So you have an analog drug bill that is in force and could in essence cause the possession with intent to give to man of anything that is substantially similar in any way to a Schedule 1 drug to be considered a crime. You have a writing of law that has authorized the understanding that if you have a material that contains a scheduled drug, the entire weight of that material may be considered a scheduled drug. And of course that in conjunction with what are called the federal guidelines for sentencing, in which if you have this much drug, you get this many years, that much drug, that many years, this much drug, that many years, and if it's an unknown drug, they have equations, this drug, 3 milligrams of that is equal to 10 milligrams of that, so by a slide rule, you can work out how many years a person is going to go to prison for having possessed something or possessed something that would be an analog. And the difficulty is, of course, if a material contains any quantity of the drug, the entire amount of the material may be considered the drug. So you drop a little bit of milligram of cocaine on the middle of the garage floor and sweep it up with a kilogram of sawdust. You have a kilogram of cocaine. And you go to prison on that basis. If you have a precursors to make a given drug, the only reason you'd have, say you had a bottle of hydroiodic acid and maybe a little can of red phosphorus. That's enough, let's say for 5 pounds of red phosphorus and maybe a gallon of HI, that's enough for 15 years in prison. Because you would not possess that unless you're intending to make methamphetamine. And at that quantity of methamphetamine, clearly you're a dealer. And that's enough to put you in prison. You have criminal situations in which the components, as I mentioned, are sufficient to cause a jury to find you guilty. You have civil situations of a much lower criterion. In criminal situations, you must establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In criminal situations, you must establish guilt by a preponderance of evidence. That means over 50%. That means one judge says, I think by and large, more than not, probably he's intending to make a drug. That's all it takes. That's over 50%. A policeman may say, I acted and entered this house on good faith, because as I saw the evidence, I was more certain than not that a crime is being committed. Not a crime, this is simple. That there would be evidence there of a crime having been committed. On good faith. You don't teach a jury that a policeman acted in bad faith very easily. In fact, you have to establish he was either a perjurer or he was reckless, neither being a particularly easy task to convince a jury of. So you have seizures that come out of this. And I think everyone at one point or another has heard his horror story about some seizure that has occurred near him where the car was taken, or the land was taken, or the airplane was taken, because they felt it was bought or it was used in conjunction with the commission of a crime. I know of one specific case. It occurred, this one fellow, having no moderately well, lives up in the area of the gold country in California. He said he came back one time after a busy day, and his neighbor, who happened to be an MD and a photographer, was standing there absolutely in shock, and he came, what's wrong? He said, you should see what ran around the corner earlier today. What was that? The authorities came, the county police, the city police, and I don't know, state or feds, you don't know what they are. They came, they went in this house, they dragged out a woman and her child. They threw the child into the police car where he cried for 45 minutes. The woman was handcuffed in the ground. They went in there and dismembered the house. They took everything apart, searching for drugs. It turned out they found no drugs. They de-handcuffed her, gave her her child back, and left. And he, being a photographer, photographed the whole operation, and the photograph film was seized. And he was in shock. This person said, "This doesn't happen where I live." He said, "But it did happen." No apology came. The film was never returned. The issue never made the newspaper. End of it. And that was right around the corner from him. And you do occasionally hear about really, really uncomfortable seizures. But these seizures can be taken. Money can be taken from you. If anyone out there has a $10 bill, and maybe it's too early in the thing, a $20 bill in his wallet, and I will give you 9 to 1 odds that I can take that $20 bill, or accept the offer of a loan of the $20 bill, and I'll go out to my auxiliary lab in San Francisco, and I'll show you a demonstration of evidence that has cocaine on it. Because cocaine is on all paper money. It is endemic through our society on paper money. But if I was a policeman, and I had $20,000 in cash on you, and I saw that $20,000, I'd have reason to believe, beyond a reasonable doubt, preponderance of evidence in this case, that it had cocaine on it. I'll seize that money. And you are up shit creek. You can't get it back. Well, you want to get it back? Sue. So you have to put a $100,000 lawsuit to get that money back. I don't have to bring a charge. I don't have to accuse you of any drug crime. I take the money and go. And the money, by the way, gets used in the prosecution of law enforcement. So in essence, it's legalized robbery. And it's not only allowed, it is encouraged in the pursuit on the war on drugs. The scandalous acceptance by a placid bunch of sheep known as the U.S. population of urine testing, of hair testing now, even more so. You look how many people you see going around with ultra-short haircuts. But they don't realize that pubic hair works pretty well too. I haven't checked, maybe they're ultra short in one direction. It used to be in conjunction with due cause. That guy was acting funny. He drove a bus in a strange way. He staggered as he walked out of the airplane as a pilot. Get a urine sample. Maybe he's in an accident. Maybe we'll take a urine sample and see if he was under the influence of something we don't approve of. Usually you check only for those things you don't approve of. And that was known for cause. It is now done on a random basis. And the searching in a person's urine on a random basis for the use of drugs constitutes the assumption of guilt, with the onus of innocence having to fall upon the person who is being charged. That is to me intolerable. I cannot conceive of a single instance, of a single situation in which the random searching of urine for a drug can be tolerated. Not a single one. I don't care if it's a joker with his finger on the trigger of an atomic rocket on a submarine. For cause, yes, but not on a random basis. I'd rather lose a city somewhere. Pilot, well, I won't even get about the pilot of Air Force One. This brings politics at a very ugly level. Okay. But I have talked to a person who is a representative at large at NIDA, who I met on another circumstance. I said, this will have to stop, this whole drug testing. He said, it'll never stop. He said, it is so heavily ingrained and so financially rewarding to the people who benefit from it. And the people have accepted it because the propaganda has been shoved out there and it's been bought. He said, another generation and the testing of urine for drugs will be as commonplace as requiring a license, fingerprints on licenses. It'll be automatically done. He said that will never change. And I'm very much afraid it won't. You now may rebel on it, but at what point is it too much? At what point, once you have a drug, admit you have to take a random drug test to work for a large corporation, more than half of the 500 require drug test approval for random tests before you are even given a job. You have to say, yes, I will agree to that. What about getting a driver's license? That'd be okay. What about getting a passport? What about picking a dozen eggs up? Do you want to submit to a random urine test? Where does it stop? That's scary. I don't know. So what is up ahead? The drug testing to me is too financially rich a thing. The whole drug situation, the use of drugs that are not approved of, is so beneficial to all levels of government, to all levels of law enforcement, to all levels of behavior control. There's no way I can see that the drug laws will be modified, let alone changed. I see an increased intolerance of people's behavior by the people who are in the position of judging propriety or impropriety behavior, and that was going to extend in many directions. I think the drug limitation, the drug war is a good example of a prediction in this direction. What are the positives? And I foresee coming. Well, there are some. There is no tunnel without light at the end. In Switzerland, as I mentioned, there is studies going on now on the material I mentioned, 2CD, LE25, on MDMA. Preparations are made for making studies in LSD, and this is in approval of the Swiss government in the psychiatric research section that is under government regulation. I just got a note from an ally in Rio de Janeiro, an article from O Globo, in which is a move has been made, and apparently will be successful, to remove the laws that inhibit private behavior with drugs, which is a beautiful, beautiful step. And Brazil has its own complications right now at a number of different higher echelon levels, and I don't think this is receiving much publicity because everyone is interested in impeaching Collor as president, and that is the big news. And this sort of slipped in on page 7 of O Globo, but I sent a copy of it. Brazil may be coming out of the dark ages in drug use. Just recently there was a meeting in the FDA in this country in which a new person who inherited one of the IND desks for psychedelic drugs in the FDA said, I got this desk and it's piled full of applications for INDs and psychedelic drugs. Why should it be stacked and be hidden? Let's act upon them. This is an interesting breath of fresh air. And in that pile remember the FDA, after 2 years of manipulation, approved a DMT study for Dr. Rick Strassman in the Southwest. And once it was approved, then everything sort of went smoothly. On the desk now in the FDA, on this desk by this new person who has a little breath of fresh air behind him, there is an application for an MDMA study in San Diego area, an application for psilocybin study by Strassman in the Southwest, and an application of LSD study in the East Coast. They are going to be considered. There may be all kinds of problems, it may be a lot of foot dragging, but they are going to be considered, which is something that would not have occurred some time ago. So this is a possible direction where things might show a bit of light. I can only hope that this will occur. What can be done? Well, obviously, to me, I'm an unremitting optimist. I say what must happen and will happen sometime, perhaps not in our lifetime, but will happen, is that drug laws will be discarded. There's no reason that there should be any drug laws whatsoever, except for those instances in which people who don't have the information to give informed consent, or of an age, or of a education that they could be hurt by that, or driving, or a variety of things where drug laws have their place. To a large measure, the dictation of what you do in private is none of the government's business. And this is a direction in which we must go. How can it be done immediately right now? Well, let me kind of wind up by giving some ideas. I really don't see any reason, I'd love to have someone give me a reason why we have a federal drug law. Every single state has a state drug law. And in almost every state it's a Xerox copy of the federal. You can eliminate the federal drug law. In principle, not lose one bit of control. And doing that, you eliminate $11 billion worth of DEA. And people are going to fight you like fury, disenfranchise me, put me out of work because you have some stupid libertarian idea. No, don't go out of work. We need your experience. Work for the state. Go out there and catch drunk drivers. Go and do this, do that, protect. We need your experience. So work a way of not disenfranchising 8 million agents and people in the DEA. Eliminate the DEA, eliminate federal drug law. You have not lost a bit of control. They say, well, the state has a different point of view. Okay, but the Constitution says that the feds don't do it. The state has that prerogative. So you're not, in essence, you're going in the spirit of the Constitution. I think these directions can be things that can be thought about. And I think a very basic, let me wind up on one basic feeling I have, and that is I believe there is no place in politics for things that deal with public health or with medicine. I think the whole, to bring up something that's quite current right now, the whole abortion thing, whether it should be allowed, not allowed, legal, illegal, not, is not a political issue. It's a public health issue, it's a personal issue, and it's a medical issue. It has no business in politics. Drug use, drug possession is exactly in that same category. There is no reason for politics in any way to play a role in dictating what is done in private with an individual where there's no one hurt by the action. So this is kind of where I see things are. There's a bit of light. There's an awful lot of darkness. Things are going very, very strongly in to me, a very uncomfortable direction. But at the moment, all I can say is enjoy it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.